Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. I'm not sure how my talk's going to go down because I haven't given it for a while, and it's about an experience at a company where I don't work anymore. So I have to remember to say nice things and not grumble, which is very hard because I like grumbling and being negative. So I was working at this company, Makers Academy, right? So I think there's some makers here, but basically it's a coding school. It's where people learn to do programming. I was not involved in that side of things. I was involved in helping them with their systems that they use within the business. Because, of course, if you're a coding school, you have to have people register for places. They want to say, hey, I'd like to come on your course. Then there are people on the course, and then they actually help people find jobs afterwards. And then there's all the kind of internal systems that happen as well. So they had and because they were a small startup and they kind of were growing and growing, becoming more and more successful, they had got to a point where the initial system had been kind of written by the founders and then, by the coaches. And then the coaches were getting really busy working with the students. So they thought, well, we'll need to hire some software engineer type person. And I had been working at Unruly, and I think Steve Hayes will be talking about Unruly tomorrow. And I was a team lead, and I was trying to get back into coding, but being a team lead in a busy company, I wasn't getting any coding time. So I saw this ad for being a Ruby developer at Makers Academy, and they said, you don't have to have programmed in Ruby to apply for this job. So I thought, right, I'm going to apply for it. So I applied for the job, and it turned out that what they really needed was not a Ruby expert, but somebody who could help steer them in terms of how do we move forward with this code. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how that went. So my definition of legacy code is it's written by somebody who's no longer around. So you arrive, there's all these different repositories in different states. Some are live, some are not live, many branches. And you have to kind of figure out, well, what's worth saving and what's not worth saving. It was actually, they had an interesting interview process. What they did was they said, we'll just give you access to our code base, and we'd like you to make some improvements. And that's your technical interview. So, I thought, oh, right, OK, so I'll look at this code base, add some tests, refactor some stuff, think about some features that are not there. And I sort of sat down and did that over a weekend with a lot of cribbing of Ruby and Rails and looking things up on the internet. And on the strength of that, they said, yes, you have a job. Now, it did have tests. It had continuous integration. It had been built by craftspeople. It was relatively clean, looked nice. So, on the surface, yes, good code base, no problems here, it'll be fine. However, I did find quite quickly that you could make a change, and the tests would all run, and then maybe later I'd discover that something had stopped working. So there were things that were kind of lying underneath in the code base to become aware of and try to understand. So actually, often you could think, right, I'm making these changes, looks all fine. So an example would be, they were using a CRM system and GitHub profiles, and they were syncing student profiles between those two systems. And they were actually calling the API to the CRM, even if they didn't have an attribute. So they would say, do a lookup by email. But they would make the call even though they didn't have the email filled in. And you think, well, that's silly. Why make an API call if you haven't got the email? I only discovered later, probably several weeks later, when I realized the data wasn't syncing, that they had some waterfall logic where basically, if you call the API to the CRM with an empty parameter, it would then throw an exception, which would then call the next thing that needed to be called. And it's one of those things where I was just going, well, obviously you don't call an API if you haven't got the parameter, but I learned that actually sometimes that can lead you into problems. The other thing that I came to realize is that really you can't understand a code base without understanding the aspirations of the company, how it came to be there, what they wanted to do with it going forward. And so a large part of what I was trying to do was to understand what does the company want to do, what's your vision, and you know, what bits do we keep? Because there was a lot of things that had been built in earlier times when different ideas had been around about what the company was about. For instance, there was a whole long period where they had a remote idea of remote boot camp students, and then they stopped doing that. And so then they had some very interesting ways of thinking about the different course types, and then they wanted to introduce new course types. So I had to do a lot of talking to people and trying to understand. When you are working mostly on your own and you're faced with a number of repositories, you have a feeling it's a bit like this. It's like you're like, okay, it's a treasure trove. There are many useful things here, but are they useful for this company? And I had to really do a lot of deciding and evaluating. You know, do I mend this? Do I get rid of it? Is it okay if I really throw this away? So what I wanted to share in this talk is some of the techniques I used. So having an agile background, I thought, well, post-it notes could help me. So I just went through a code base kind of looking for every single external thing that was called and tried to write these things on post-it notes. So if and obviously I don't expect you to read this, and I also don't want to fall off the edge here. There are different groups of stakeholders, so I kind of tried to draw them along the top. So you've got clients, you've got the internal people, the onboarding team, the careers team, the hiring partners, students, job hunters, and then the people that they wanted to do things with, like they were wanting to move into apprenticeships. And then the actual systems are in this middle layer here, but they were using a lot of third-party things for payment systems, for booking interviews, for forms, and the code was kind of like glue between all of these third-party systems. So one technique was to use this kind of mapping to try and identify what was there. Another thing I tried to do was generate models. So I think this was generated using Rails ERD. I don't know if anyone's used that before. This did tell me something. Like basically, what I discovered was that the core of this system called Hub, which I'm not even sure now whether they use, because I'm now not in touch with the company because I've moved and started working in another place. There is, I mean, what could you tell about this diagram? Is there something that knows a bit too much about things, right? Okay. So this thing is a student, right? And all of these are really actually attributes of the student. They're not even very separate things. But the system didn't have the concept of different kinds of users. There is another kind of user, but it's all just a parent of the student. It's like this, it's somewhere up here. There's an administrator. So what I wanted to be able to do was to change the system to have the possibility of having users who could have different roles. So they could move from being, you know, a person who's interviewing for the course, then being a student, then being a job hunter, then potentially being an alumni, and that they could have different views when they were using the system. So using these generated models helped me to start figuring out where the work was going to be. I did do some things like making an inventory, kind of making lists of what are all the things. Also, you know, what are we paying for? There were a bunch of things we were paying for that were no longer in use. So we could save some money by stopping paying for those things. Like I think we had some Kibana stuff we weren't using and things like this, where people had kind of thought, oh, I fancy doing a bit of this, and then it had been left not active anymore. I also spent a bit of time actually shadowing the users within the business. So I went to sit with the team who find the students' jobs and just watch how they use the software or how they couldn't use the software. So it was really interesting, and I do encourage you, if you are taking ownership of a system, try to go and sit, just watch somebody use that software, just do their job, maybe even only for 20 minutes or something like that, and you will probably reveal a lot of things that you could improve, and many of those things can be quite simple to improve. I think probably after I'd been there about 2 weeks, people said, oh, you know, there's some bugs, can you fix this bug, can you fix that bug? And so the first actual code changes I made were bug fixing. But even bug fixing can be a bit of a challenge because it's a little bit of a negotiation. And I don't mean the actual fixing of the technical problem, it's agreeing what the solution is. So here's an example of one of the first things that I fixed. So it doesn't look very exciting. It's a field where you put your phone number in. This is for a coding school based in London, with one office in London at the time, having students that were in London. And they had a flag representing the country that your phone number belonged to. But it was showing the wrong country flag for some reason. So I went well, the first thing I said was, well, you don't really need to show a flag, do you? You could just have people put their phone number in. But they said, and I did eventually, the first fix that I did was to say, let's just stop showing the flag. But what I found as I dug deeper into it was that the reason it was showing the wrong flag is because it was trying to work out their country based on their IP address. And it was also storing attributes like their latitude and their longitude. And again, I felt like for a coding school in London, this is probably information that they didn't need to store, and that I could delete that code. And so I took the flag away, but eventually I put it back again because it looks nice to have a flag. But it's this kind of thing where when you're trying to help a company with a system, there is a negotiation going on. So you could say, all right, well, I could spend some time showing the right flag. But that would take me longer, and I could bet, I wouldn't be fixing these other bugs. Or if you really, really want the right flag, then I'm going to rip out the stuff about the longitude and latitude, and I'm going to do it based on the number that they enter, and we're going to use a library. And again, none of these pieces of work are very big, but it's about establishing what's the value of this company? What are they trying to do? Is this really helping them? So sometimes things would take longer to fix than other things because there would be a lot of interesting problems that were revealed. Even in this lovely clean code base, there was still strange anomalies where people hadn't had time to finish off a particular feature, for example. So occasionally there would be, things that were not working. There was a bug in the CRM that caused us to store the wrong email address for the wrong person. But because it wasn't a quick fix, we had to kind of just say, well, this is happening now. Just be aware, it's happening. We're sorting it out, but we can't sort everything out at the same time. Of course, there were many requests for tickets. My ticket's more important than yours, and your ticket's more important. And so I had to try to bring people together to say, let's agree, what are we going to build? What's the most important thing for the company? And this requires thinking, well, what's the company trying to do? And if you're a coding school, should you really be developing your own software systems to support your registration process? And so there was a lot of trying to help people understand, is this an asset that your organization should be investing in? So it turned out that I had to do a lot of saying no because there was only one of me and I could only fix one thing at a time, really. And also, there were dubious value propositions behind some of the things that were there. So in order to get this across to people, I actually had to spend a lot of time trying to explain how complicated the system that had been built was, and also using metaphors. So, for example, people are familiar with the idea that if you buy a car, you take it to the garage for servicing, you have to top up levels of fluids, you replace the brake pads. Software is a bit the same. You know, you have to invest some time improving it, you have to upgrade the libraries, you know, it's not just a sort of thing, we built it and then it shall run forever. And so, again, I used some tooling. So I don't know if anyone has used web sequence diagrams. This is a tool that generates these sequence diagrams. And I used it to have some conversations with the CFO, because basically, I don't know, this is obviously you can't read all the words on here, but you can see that there's some interesting interactions that are happening. And what I was trying to explain was the payment API that they were using had announced that they were moving to a new version, and they were no longer supporting the previous thing that we were using. And so we would have to introduce extra input screens for students to fill stuff in, or move to a more expensive solution. And so I used the message sequence diagrams to go through with the Chief Finance Officer to kind of go, look, this is what it's doing now. Goes to here, goes to here, goes to here, goes to here, so that he could understand then and make a decision about whether we extended that complicated system or whether we actually would move just to manual reconciliation, which is what we ended up doing. I said, look, given the time frame, I don't think it's wise to rewrite this complicated thing. I actually think what you should do is, given that maybe they had 2 registrations of people paying per day, it was fine that somebody in the finance team would just check those payments and not have when they registered this whole flow of events would happen. So one of the challenges that you do find when you're working with organizations where they feel like they've invested some time in something, it feels like, you know, we bought this thing. So now it's an asset that we have, and we don't want to part with it. We don't want to let go of it. But what you have to persuade them is, like, actually, this is costing you. You know, it's costing my time to maintain it. It's costing the business when it goes wrong. So you have to kind of understand that, yes, you threw money at that, but now you're throwing even more money at that. And actually, sometimes it's better to say, let's not do that anymore. This is not generating enough value for you to really keep. So there was a lot of discussions around that kind of thing. I was surprised, but maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, that I'd literally been there maybe 4 weeks, and they started saying, well, where's the roadmap of all the features we shall have? And I kind of countered that by saying, well, where are the roadmaps for all of the other departments? Because there weren't any. But I think they had this idea, like software development, you know, there should be a roadmap, you know, there'll be a rollout of lots of nice features. And what it kind of pointed to was that, and then this actually happened, was that the startup was kind of going through a transitionary period where they were clarifying their vision of what they really wanted to do in the future. And really, it didn't make any sense to build more software until that was clear. So they had a number of off-site meetings. They realized that they did want to expand the company into these, into doing apprenticeships through the government apprenticeship scheme. They realized they wanted to stop doing remote courses. And so with that information, it was then possible to choose what to work on. But in the absence of a vision, it's very hard to figure out, like, where do I spend my time when maintaining software. I have a picture of a tree because I was trying to think of how to represent branches. I don't know if anyone's ever come across repositories that have branches that have had long things built out that have been never merged into master. And I had to kind of go through each one of those and try and resurrect the code on those branches to try and understand, was it valuable or not? So, for instance, one of the branches I found was highly valuable, and the careers team found it useful to be able to have not only a student view, but a job hunter view within this tool. And they could see, like, quickly see a set of profiles of all the people who were on a particular cohort and were job hunting. Now, that code had been lying there for 6 months, and it had just never been made available to them. But there were also other things which had an underlying assumption which probably would never be, they had kind of been built without thinking the full thing through, basically. So they had relationships with employers where they would like the employers to create jobs for students to apply for within their portal. And they had a simple solution, which was using a type form, which then kind of input information into the system that could be resurrected into a job. But they were thinking perhaps they could have something where companies would actually log in themselves and create these jobs. But they hadn't really thought about the user management of the people who would be doing that. And actually, it's very unlikely that you would have somebody in a HR team that would have a GitHub ID, for example, to create jobs for their company. And you can't really make that a prerequisite that everybody who works with our system also has to have a GitHub ID. So that was a branch that I got rid of. And it's one of these things where you kind of had to dig into the code, resurrect it, and then go, built on a strange assumption, or, yes, this could be really useful. And it was quite interesting trying to figure out which things had value and which things had assumptions that did not prove to be true, basically. I do think it's a useful practice to keep a log, and I don't mean a wooden log, I actually just mean a written journal. So one of the things that, when you are working on your own, and when you are working through a lot of code, I find it's very useful to, on a daily basis, kind of make a note of what things I've changed, so that I can summarize this back to the stakeholders and say, yes, like this week, I've changed these things. This week, I've changed those things. This week, all my time went on this fire over here. And it helps you to have a sense of progress. If you can keep a log and on a daily basis, then you can look back at the end of the month and go, oh yeah, I am making some difference. And so I just suggest it is a practical technique that you can use so that you don't kind of feel that you're drowning in code. And I'm probably finishing my talk way too early, but I'm getting to the summing up point. So as you can understand, I've been talking about legacy code, but I haven't been talking about legacy code in a terribly technical way. A lot of it is not just receiving tickets and making changes. It's actually feeling like engineers are stakeholders in a system, and you have to proactively put a point forward about what is valuable to maintain, what is not valuable to maintain. So I think it's important for software cross people to feel like you are stakeholders in your system, that code is an asset to be managed, and the non-technical people in your company do not know the complexity that is lying beneath in the code base. So you have a responsibility to make that visible to people so they can make decisions. So the idea that Steve was talking about coloring things or making it clear, you know, this is in a really bad way, or that's in a good state. That's the kind of thing that needs to be thought about. And in an organization, just because people ask for a thing doesn't mean that they really, really need it, or it is matching up with the business strategy or the longer-term view of what the company wants to do. And then, kind of finally, it's very important when you are going home at the end of each day to feel like every day I have made some small improvements and that I have left the code in a better shape than it was yesterday. And I think that's what I certainly strive to do. And I hope that everybody here feels that that's the kind of thing that they can do in the code bases that they work, that they are making a positive difference. So I've talked about a bunch of things around legacy code. I think the final thing is really to say, you have to let it go. You have to move on. It's OK to delete things, and the world will carry on working. It's OK to say, yeah, this is not a good idea. Let's delete this. We won't do this anymore. And so I'd encourage you to let bits of the system go rather than try and keep them alive at great expense, basically. So I'm sure I've finished massively early, but that's the end of my talk. Thank you. And I don't know if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. I have a question on to what extent were you able to kind of engender the same perspective among the other engineers on the team?
There were no other engineers. So that was, I mean, there was briefly one other engineer, but then he got made redundant. So there was just me. So it was much, I would say if you're a solo engineer, it enables you to make choices and you don't have any arguments. So. I don't know if there's any other questions.
Hi. We've heard a lot today about technical debt and legacy code, but I believe there's also a thing called requirements, legacy requirements, so like this. So people in the business also move, they move companies, knowledge is lost. So what happens when you find a feature or something that you believe technically, okay, we don't need this, and then you go to your stakeholders and figure out and try to ask them, okay, I don't believe we need this. And the response that you get, and it's happened to me quite a lot, is, oh, I don't know, but it was built for a reason. So can you prove that we don't need it?
Yeah, so there was a lot of conversations like that where people were going, people would want to keep a thing because they believed it would enable them to build another thing. And they were like, no, this is the first part of this big vision to do this other thing. And we're like, well, let's delete it for now. Or like, so I think I genuinely made efforts to try and find out, is this in use? There were like things like the longitude, latitude stuff, that was not in use, that was just there. But then there were things where you think, well, okay, so they had a thing where you could express your learning style, for example, but people were not using it. So we decided that, if nobody's really looking at that, we would delete that. So, I didn't just delete things without asking. I always made a case for, like, I think that we shouldn't be doing this, or I think we should move to a different third-party product. So I think the other thing that I spent quite a bit of time working with the exec team is to say, look, you have this Rails code base for this application system, and probably that's not what you want to do. They also had, for changing content on the website, they would actually have the marketing team editing YAML files and committing them to Git, and then I would be asked to review their pull requests for content changes. And really, what they wanted was they wanted a content management system. But they then were faced with the challenge of not knowing how to choose a content management system. So then, actually, sometimes I was involved in evaluating third-party software things to replace use of the things that they'd built. Because when you're a startup, obviously you kind of bootstrap, you build your own things, because you can't afford to buy the the third-party stuff. But once you become successful, that's when you want to move on to more maintained software, I would say, rather than doing the software development in-house.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I would like to ask about alternative definition for legacy code, which is code without tests, which in this case you said there were tests.
There were tests,
but whenever you change something, they were still passing. So does it reflect on kind of tests are not made equal, right? So the test needs to reflect what the business value of the system is, and they may be passing without actually executing any code.
Yeah, I think often people write a lot of tests that are unit tests, which run fast, which is sensible, but also the tests that run end-to-end, particularly on scenarios where you're using a third-party system and there may be some time delay. So it's quite hard to have an automated test where you kind of update a thing, then some things happen, and then another thing. So there were scenarios, for example, the thing that I got caught out with was this syncing between GitHub profiles and CRM profiles, which superficially seemed to be working because the profiles were still there, but it was only some of them were not being updated. So, and then I realized what was going on when somebody said, oh, I don't think these profiles have synced recently. And I looked and I went, oh, no, they haven't. But there were no tests for that part. There were an awful lot of tests for things that wouldn't break ever. They're very kind of tightly coupled unit tests. But I think that's because when you're developing TDD, people do tend to kind of perhaps over-test. And they, like every single method they'd added had unit tests around it, which, superficially good, but it did mean that if you wanted to change things, you were kind of quite closely hemmed in with those tests.
How did you address the situation? Did you went and write an end-to-end test which demonstrated, or?
Let me think, because it's so long ago now. It's like, because I left there in February, I've almost forgotten.
How would you have done it now?
How would I do it now? I think now we do have more. Where I'm working now, I'm working in a microsystems environment, and we do have to have a good level of acceptance tests that are more kind of checking endpoints are working, and the results that we get back, we can be fed into the system. I think there is, if you write those tests where you kind of go, this is the fake output that I'm expecting to get, and you're not testing it that that's really what you get, then you can get caught out. So I think you need a certain level of testing against real systems, if you can.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm guessing there's no more questions. It's really bright up here.
Yeah, cheers. My question is, so you often have legacy code base. Quite often it also comes alongside with legacy, essentially software or tools. So Visual Studio 2008 and things like that.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Do you have any strategies for dealing with that?
I don't, because in this particular instance, actually, I was kind of unusual because the previous developers were more kind of Vim editor type people, whereas I had an IDE, which actually helped a great deal with looking for things across code bases. And so I did use an IDE, and I would always recommend using an IDE, but I don't have an experience of being locked into an old IDE, which I guess is your question.
It's okay. I was just curious.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, you mentioned that you have microservice environment right now. How do you test? I mean, there is a whole bunch of stuff.
Oh, this is kind of completely different. And so now
Okay, maybe after then.
So now I'm working in a JavaScript microservices environment where it's like JavaScript front end and back end, and we have. I would say actually there is a very good video of a talk that was given at Skills Matter by our CTO, Clifton Cunningham, and he would be able to, I don't feel that I can summarize quickly without the aid of diagrams.
Okay.
But I can talk to you afterwards about it. I'd be happy
All right,
to
sure.
explain. Yeah.
I'll be happy to hear.
Yeah.
Cool.
Frank Doc, did you perceive any change in your relationship with the business from the time you arrived? Did you saw any tipping points?
So I think when I was hired, there was the assumption I would grow a big software team, and we would build, we would build lots of new software. And because my reaction to the software that was there was to say, I don't think you should invest in these things. I think you should start to look at third party. I think that did prompt some of the conversations. The leadership team were already having conversations about what direction should we go, and they saw this big opportunity to do these apprenticeships. But what they realized actually is better go with a third-party system for the apprenticeships to support that until they knew that that would prove out and be a successful thing for them to do as a business, than me hire a load of people and us bolt it onto the other. So I feel that some of the tipping point was my resistance to growing the team. So all I would say is my lesson to other people is just try to reflect your confidence in what you see the code as being, and don't just go, oh, you want to hire developers? Right, well, I'll get all my friends. It's more responsible to say, I don't think you're the kind of business that should be developing software. I think you should be the kind of business who's developing students. And so that's really their core business model. And so when I joined, it was like, oh, I would be involved in the leadership team. And then they realized that actually their core mission was really much more about being an excellent place to help software engineers learn, not building their own software. And so I think I helped, but who knows? Okay, I think that must be it with the questions. There's one more at the end? Okay, right.
How would you approach fear of a legacy code base?
Well, so I don't know. Fear in others or fear in myself? So I usually think, oh, I like legacy code because it's more complicated, I think, and more interesting. And you have to delve in and try and figure out what it's doing, and then what is it really doing. So I find it an interesting challenge to work. So I would say it may not have the kind of glitzy glamour of building new things with all the latest frameworks, but it's actually stretches your software engineering muscles for you to try and figure out how something works, and then how to improve it. Because I've talked a lot about not doing things and deleting things, but I did actually extend some things. I did change parts of the system. And I think that is challenging sometimes. The ERD I showed, for example, with the big student in the middle, that was quite hard to start breaking that out into the idea that there was job hunting people who had finished the course as well as students. And then another thing that was difficult to break out was people who hadn't become students yet but were on a pre-course learning part of the training. And just gradually breaking that big ERD apart was challenging. So I found it interesting anyway. Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you.